Several years ago, a small startup placed all their eggs in the Google Drive basket and then proceeded to set that basket on fire. With one fatal click by an admin, over $1 million went up in smoke. Today, we investigate the tragic tale of Musey, a promising young company building an innovative app who lost everything when their Google account was wiped out instantly. This is our second in a series called Cloud Disasters. Organizations that thought their data in the cloud was protected, only to find out it wasn't. It was too late for them, but not for you. Hi, I'm W. Curtis Preston, aka Mr. Backup, and my goal with this podcast is to make sure that something like that never happens to you. This is the Backup Wrap-Up. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, W. Curtis Preston, and I have with me Prasanna Malaiyandi. How's it going, Prasanna?
I'm doing well, Curtis.
We're talking about this concept of things that people think don't need to be backed up, and they definitely need to be backed up. And we're zooming in and doing a deep dive into each of the stories that we often talk about when we reference this, right? So these are typically cloud systems, cloud services that people thought they were backed up, and then when they accidentally screwed something up, they found that they weren't backed.
They were relying on it for their business and for their livelihood, and bad things happen.
And sometimes, many times, those things are like attacks, things like that. In this case, though, this one is, it's a reminder that we spent a lot of time on the podcast talking, especially lately, about cyber attacks and things like that and ransomware. And we don't talk that much about equipment failure because typically, thanks to the advent of RAID and erasure coding and things like that, generally that's not the reason people restore data. The interesting thing about this story is one interesting thing that I found out, or that I noticed, was that it was only covered by the register. So thanks to the folks over there, I don't even know how they, found it. Somebody sent it to them, and then nobody else covered it, which is interesting because I looked around, I couldn't find any coverage of it.
So this is about a company called Musey, which also I found out goes by the name of Moss, Moss. They do have a Facebook page that you can find. But they were a company that was building an interior design app that would be used by influencers, home decorators, and other folks to sort of showcase what you see on the inside of a house. And basically, somehow, someone went and deleted their entire G Suite account for the entire company, which contained all of their data. And from what I could tell, they weren't doing backups. And that's kind of where things start now. They try to get the data back. And I think we'll talk about that in a little bit, about what they did to try to get their data back from Google. But yeah, like Curtis says, it's not a happy ending.
Yeah. It appears that it was their admin, right? The idea that I remember hearing was that they were trying to delete a test account, but instead of deleting a test account, they deleted the production account. And we need to be very specific here. They didn't delete a user, right? In Google Drive or Google Workspace, you can have users underneath your account. They deleted the entire account.
The organization's account.
Yeah, the entire organization, right? According to their court filing, they did immediately contact Google and say, hey, this thing happened. And I'm going to say, sadly, the Google support rep said, I'll get right on it, rather than saying, yeah, you're screwed.
Not my problem.
Yeah, not my problem. Yeah, you're screwed. You should have backed that up. Where's your backups? What the Google person allegedly said was, we'll get right on it. Meanwhile, they're out there desperately trying to reach someone at Google for multiple days, even multiple weeks. Meanwhile, they're not able to contact their customers, are not able to, access any of their intellectual property. So apparently they had built this entire app and everything was stored in G Drive. And apparently, they weren't. I'm just saying, based on what happened, it does not appear that they were synchronizing, because you can synchronize Google Drive down to your desktop. And if they had deleted the account up there, the desktop copy probably would have remained. But they didn't do that, because once they had deleted this the cloud version of it,
Yeah.
they had nothing, right? So they had nothing in their intellectual property that they had built, that they had spent $1.5 million on, right? That was
Yep.
in the court filings, that they had spent $1.5 million on this company so far. And they also mentioned that they weren't able to contact their customers, they weren't able to do business. And there is, they said a few weeks later, I feel like saying a few moments later.
I now have that in your head, don't
Yeah, it's your fault. Um, Google, Google did get back to them and say they can't get their data back. I think the weirdest part of the story that you might want to talk about is this. They're saying that someone at Google, and I don't see any evidence of this, but they're saying someone at Google said something along the lines of, maybe you could get the data back with a court filing. Did you see anything about that?
I didn't see anything in the articles about that, but that's just weird. The only time I could see that happening is potentially if they had kept some of that data because of legal hold or some legal reason,
Yeah.
or if for some reason they had a copy somewhere else. Like I can imagine in the case of doing like a disaster recovery copy, maybe they had that copy somewhere else and you can get the data back. Right? It's
Yeah.
not their obligation, it's like a best effort.
Right. I agree with both scenarios. I like that first one. The second one, we talk a lot about how many of these service providers, they do have a backup, as I make quotes in the air, of like the entire data center that they can use to bring the data center back if they screw it up, right?
Yeah.
But that it's not built for you. I give an example of Microsoft 365 says that they have a delayed copy of Exchange that can be used if they screw up the entire Exchange environment. But when I asked them directly as a Microsoft 365 customer, can I use that delayed copy of Exchange to restore my environment? They just said no. Right.
Yeah.
So maybe that's a scenario where somebody might have been
Yeah.
alluding to it. I don't know if that person was, um, talking out of school. Right.
Yeah. But
Um,
and also just along that, like if they were $1 billion company, I'm sure that it would have been a different result. Or Google may have been more willing to jump in and help versus a smaller company like this.
Yeah, I'm not sure if the result would have been different. I think maybe the
No,
activities
yeah.
along the
Yeah.
way would have been the
Yeah.
same. But by the way, where we get this comment about the subpoena or civil request was in their lawsuit, and I have to say, I feel for these guys of what happened to them, because when I look at the filing, like, you really have to see it to, like, you have to literally lay your eyes on it. And we'll put a
Yeah.
link to it in the show notes. And what you see is a good portion of it is typed up and sort of like normal. And then there's all these like handwritten notes all over it. Like at the very beginning, there's this like star, and it says, serving a civil request to have access to our data restored or provided as outlined in document for serving civil subpoenas and civil requests given to us, emailed, it says, by Google, um, i.e., Google sent us instructions to get our data back. Um, and then they just sort of lay out this story in this lawsuit, which they say in the lawsuit, we're not suing to get money, we're suing to get our data back. They basically believed that Google had a copy of their data, and Google, clearly did not have a copy of their data.
Yeah. And just looking at the filing, I don't think a lawyer wrote that.
No, oh,
Right?
yeah, thanks for bringing that
Yeah.
up. It is
Yeah.
actually listed as a per se lawsuit, which
Yeah.
means that they filed it themselves.
Yeah. And just like, yeah, with the handwriting and everything else, you could tell that it was an individual who was not an attorney writing and typing. And I know that would, like you mentioned, Curtis, they wanted their data back, and they were mentioning sort of what type of data they had stored in Google Drive, right? It was their IP, UI, UX mockups, user research, and a whole bunch of
Right.
other things, algorithm decisions, how they built it. But the other thing is, they're like, yeah, in our emails, we also had medical records about someone's nephew who was undergoing some treatment, and they needed access to their emails as
Right. That
well.
was the weirdest part, I think, was just reading that they had intermixed. What? I don't know. That just that part made no sense to
Yeah.
me. Like, it's not like they stored. It's not like this was the only copy of their nephew's medical records.
Yeah.
Like it was their only copy of the nephew's medical records. I thought that was very odd. But the thing in the filing is that this was a filing in the federal U.S. District Court for the Northern District of California. By the way, this was in the Bay Area, and and so you have to give reason why the federal court would be the jurisdiction, and they listed multiple reasons for that. But what we do know from the dockets, I was able to find that the lawsuit was withdrawn basically just under 2 weeks later.
Yeah. That's suspicious. Yeah. Well, I think one thing we should also mention is this happened in what year, Curtis?
2019.
Okay. Yeah. So this was a while ago. The interesting thing, and this is all just,
Yeah, we're hypothesizing.
I-
But I did my best to try to find
yeah.
out everything I could, but this is our best effort to
Yeah.
figure out what happened.
Yeah. And I think like, just given the time frames, I know it was 2 weeks later after it was filed, either they decided or they maybe got legal counsel and talked to someone. They were like, yeah, you're screwed based on Google's response. Or Google might have come after them and been like, hey, if you really want to go through this, you're going to fail. And then you're going to have to pay all our court fees, attorney
Right,
fees,
right,
in
right.
which case that would be like, I can't even imagine a
Right,
Google attorney and how much that would cost, because it would be external counsel and everything else.
right.
So they probably were like, yeah, it's not worth it. Or maybe they talked to someone at Google who said, look, we understand this is tough luck, but this is what it is. And so maybe they had some sense knocked into them, and they were like, yeah, this doesn't make sense to move forward with. It sucks. I feel for them, but there
Yeah,
isn't much that Google could really do at that point.
yeah. What was another sort of interesting thing about the story? I'm not sure why the dates don't line up in the filing. The lawsuit filing, they said that the deletion happened on June 8th of 2019. The domain went up for sale on June 6th of 2019. The
Mm,
reason why I say that is the Internet Archive found that, right. The latest update for the website from 2019 was that it went for it said domain available for purchase June 6th of 2019, which would suggest that the deletion happened on June 5th or June 6th. But I thought that
well,
was
it's,
I thought that was a little bit strange.
and I don't mean to throw shade at the company, but it could also be possible that the company just realized it's not feasible what they're trying to do in the timeframes they're given, and ran out of cash, and we're like, yeah. The one interesting thing is the fact that they're completely gone from the web, right? There's no trace of them on the internet anywhere, right? It's just really weird. Like, you can always find traces of a company that's gone bust somewhere,
Right.
right? And
Yeah,
like you
and
mentioned,
that's
the Register is the only company that held this article.
yeah, and that's why what I was using the Internet Archive for, and the musieapp.com was the website, and it, like I said, it showed that it went up for purchase, and then it stayed that same way for another like a year and a half, and then it got bought by a Japanese anime artist, which is a really weird domain for a Japanese anime artist. But in 2021, and the co-founder that was mentioned in the article left the company a few months later. About I think they might have tried to make a go of it with what was in their memory or something, tried to bring again, that's just pure conjecture, but the company ceased to exist in essentially in 2020. It's a sad story. From a single mistake of an admin, an entire company goes bust because they didn't have a backup of their cloud data.
Yep. That's scary, right? When you think about it,
Yeah.
because it's not just the company, right? It's all the time and effort all the employees put in, right? All the customers who were hoping and buying products based on what they were promised, right? All of the things that they wanted, it's all like poof, gone.
Yeah. Yeah. And all the all those poor employees that were hoping probably for some IPO,
Yeah.
payout or some kind of acquisition or whatever. Obviously, all that goes by. Um, so when we think about this, what kind of thoughts come to your mind?
Well, the first, of course, and I know like we always like to talk about this, is backup, 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 right?
Yeah.
Don't trust that your cloud provider is going to be backing up your data. Do your backups yourselves, keep a copy because that could easily have saved this company.
Yeah, it would have made it a non-event. It'd be a nice story to tell at cocktail parties about the time we almost lost the company, but and that admin would still have a job, right?
Yep.
But unfortunately, they weren't backing it up. And again, this was a SaaS service, right? Let's just make sure we understand this. This wasn't the same as the first story that we talked about. That was an IaaS service, infrastructure as a service. This was a software as a service. This was Google Drive. This was Google Workspace, which is what it's now called. And they had stored their entire world in that and then deleted it. If this story doesn't prove to you that SaaS services aren't backing up your data, number one, number two, that they have no legal obligation to bring your data back when you lose it, I don't know what story would, right?
Yeah.
Because they were sued, right? They did I mean, it was a hastily filed, sort of poorly written filing, but it they withdrew it for a couple weeks later, right? We don't have any details on that, but it wasn't good. The other thing is, again, I mentioned it already, but just to remember that, I often like to throw out the phrase from Shakespeare, right? There's more in heaven and earth that is dreamt of in your
Mhm.
philosophy, and I think sometimes we focus a little bit too much lately on cyber attacks and things. Just realize sometimes people just do dumb stuff. In fact, there's a couple of the stories that we have coming. It's just somebody doing something dumb, somebody making a fat finger. The title of the headline for this was, admin fat fingers this company and basically deletes his whole company. So just realize it's human error. Prior to hackers taking over everything, human error was the number one reason we did restores, right? Now it's
Yeah.
human error and direction. I don't know
Yeah.
what category you want to put that in. It's not always hackers.
So the next one is really around keeping personal stuff on your corporate drive. I know it's hard. Everyone works remotely, right? You have a laptop. It's like, oh, it's too hard for me to go grab a personal device and start using that for personal stuff. Like, who doesn't log into Gmail from their work computer, honestly, right? Or from their phone. And so things do intermix, but the problem is what happens on a corporate drive, don't expect it if it's your personal stuff that it will be kept forever and that it's safe, right?
Yeah, not
Personal stuff you should really take ownership of.
not to mention that by putting medical information on a company drive, you're subjecting that company to HIPAA requirements.
Yeah.
It's not something that you should be doing, on your, on corporate systems, right? Just
Yeah.
not. Yeah, there's no. Not to mention, you leave the company, right? You're laid
Yep.
off. You're fired. They have no obligation to give you that data back, right?
Yeah.
The other thing is, again, that I would just want to mention that one of the reasons why people talk about cloud data not needing a backup is they're like, oh, well, there's always this recycle bin. Some deletions aren't covered by the recycle bin.
Like account deletion.
Yeah, account deletion. There are things that you can do in Salesforce. I was looking at a company that is specializing in backing up intro, which is what Microsoft Azure AD is now called. They were listing a handful of things that when you mess them up in intra, they're not covered by the recycle bin. And this is another example, is that there are a number of things. Again, there are more things in heaven on earth than
Yeah.
you are dreamt of. In Salesforce, I know, for example, when you change a record, not when you delete a record, but when you change a record, that's not covered by the recycle bin. They don't put the
No.
old version of that record.
That would be crazy if they did that. Could you
Yeah,
imagine?
exactly.
I think this just goes to the point that backups are critical. You can't trust that there aren't going to ever be these types of events, right? That just go and don't have a recycle bin, or maybe even the product doesn't even have a recycle bin, or your admin disabled the recycle bin. What are you going to do at that point?
Or the hacker is able to clear out the recycle bin, because
Yeah.
recycle bins can be cleared out manually. Or what they can do is they can set the versions to 1. All these.
Yeah.
They're just it's just a whole bunch of things. This is why we back up, right? This is why it's just so frustrating to me that there are groups of people, some of them who specialize in the platforms that we're talking about, who say, "Oh, well, you don't really have to back it up," despite us. There's a story, at least one story, for
Mm.
every major platform we talk about, and we're going to
Yeah.
cover those stories in subsequent episodes. So back up, back up, and make sure that backup is stored somewhere other than the thing we're talking about, right? Because
Yeah.
that's the other problem with the recycle bin, is that it's stored inside the thing, right? Or versioning is stored inside the thing.
Or in this case, if they had backed it up to, say, a Google Drive under the same account, that wouldn't have saved them
That
either.
wouldn't have saved them. Yeah, yeah. You need to back it up to another account. To another account. If we're talking about cloud to cloud backups, just make sure it's backed up to another account that has different, authentication and authorization, and has really, really tight least privilege turned on,
Yeah.
and a different region, perhaps, right? Um, there are other services to pull it out of the cloud if that's what you want to do, but just make sure you're not leaving it all in the same place.
Yeah.
There are services to back up Google Drive. There are services to back up all of the things that we're talking about. And that would be my favorite way. If we're talking about how to back up the cloud, my favorite way to back up the cloud would be to back it up to the cloud, do cloud to cloud backups, but back it up to another service that you're paying to do this right?
The reason I'm laughing,
What's
you know
that?
why I'm laughing?
Why?
Because you bought into the cloud service because you didn't want to manage equipment, infrastructure, patching, all of that stuff.
Yeah.
And if you went and you're like, hey, I'm going to go deploy an on-premises backup solution so I can pull my data down from the cloud because I want to manage it and I want to do all the other stuff, that just seems kind of backwards.
Yeah, I know. I know there's at least one major company that does it this way. And I'm not saying it's necessarily wrong. It just doesn't. It doesn't seem right. Right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Unless you have a very specific use case for needing that particular solution. I can imagine there are cases.
There are.
Otherwise,
I will say that there are those who disagree with me and feel that we want to get it out of the cloud for backup reasons, right? That the cloud is somehow inherently untrustable,
unsafe.
for
Yeah.
example, and so we're going to pull it out of the cloud and store it in a data center. And I just disagree with those people.
Yeah.
We can agree to disagree on that one,
Yeah. Well, I'll give you a perfect example is data sovereignty.
right?
Requirements might dictate that you pull it out and hold it locally.
Yeah, it might be. It might be a valid example or a reason why you might want
Yeah.
to do that. So, well, our second sad story from the series. So thanks for helping me tell the story, Prasanna.
I'm so depressed, Curtis, but hopefully
Yeah,
it's a learning lesson for other folks.
yeah. We don't want anyone experiencing Schadenfreude, right? We don't want them taking joy in these misfortunes. We want them learning
Yeah.
from these misfortunes. We can definitely do that. And with that, I want to thank our listeners. Be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss an episode. that is a wrap. The Backup Wrap-Up is written, recorded, and produced by me, W. Curtis Preston. If you need backup or DR consulting, content generation, or expert witness work, check out backupcentral.com. You can also find links for my O'Reilly books on the same website. Remember, this is an independent podcast, and any opinions that you hear are those of the speaker and not necessarily an employer. Thanks for listening.